In the sweltering summer of 1540, the most powerful man in England, after the king himself, found his world crumbling in a matter of days. Thomas Cromwell, the son of a blacksmith, had risen from humble beginnings to become the Earl of Essex and Henry VIII's chief minister. His journey from the forge to the court was a testament to his cunning intelligence and ruthless ambition. But as he stood at the pinnacle of power, he was about to learn that in the treacherous world of Tudor politics, the higher one climbs, the harder the fall. Cromwell's ascent was nothing short of miraculous. Born around 1485 in Putney, he fled England after a violent altercation with his father, seeking fortune in the bustling markets and bloody battlefields of continental Europe. In Italy, he absorbed the ruthless political philosophies of Machiavelli and mastered the sophisticated financial systems that would later serve him well in Henry's court. Returning to England with wealth and connections, he entered the service of Cardinal Wolsey in the 1520s. His sharp legal mind and understanding of both canon and civil law made him indispensable during the complex negotiations surrounding Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. When Wolsey fell from grace in 1529, Cromwell deftly distanced himself from his former master, while positioning himself as indispensable to the king. By 1532, he had become Henry's principal secretary, and his influence grew exponentially. He was the architect of the English Reformation, not out of religious conviction, but from cold political calculation. The break with Rome solved Henry's matrimonial problems while filling the royal coffers with confiscated monastery wealth. Cromwell's methodical approach to dismantling centuries of religious tradition demonstrated both his administrative genius and his complete lack of sentimentality. His methods were as efficient as they were ruthless. The beginning of Cromwell's downfall can be traced to a single diplomatic miscalculation that would prove catastrophic. In his eagerness to secure Henry's fourth marriage and forge a Protestant alliance with the German princes, Cromwell had negotiated the king's betrothal to Anne of Cleves, without ensuring Henry's personal approval of the bride. The marriage contracted in late 1539 was politically sound, but personally disastrous for the king. When Henry first laid eyes on Anne of Cleves in January 1540, his reaction was immediate and devastating for Cromwell's future. The king, who had expected a beautiful bride based on Holbein's flattering portrait, instead found a woman he considered plain and unsuitable. Henry's famous description of Anne as a Flanders mare reflected not just his personal disappointment, but his growing resentment toward the minister who had arranged the match. The political implications of Henry's marital dissatisfaction extended far beyond personal preference. The marriage represented a commitment to the Protestant German princes at a time when Henry was reconsidering his foreign policy options. The Catholic powers of Europe, particularly Emperor Charles V, were offering attractive alternatives that would require abandoning the Protestant alliance that Cromwell had so carefully constructed. Cromwell found himself trapped between his commitment to the German alliance and his need to satisfy the king's growing desire to escape his unwanted marriage. His attempts to find legal grounds for annulment were complicated by the very thoroughness with which he had negotiated the original marriage contract. The political framework he had created to support the match now became an obstacle to dissolving it. The plot against Thomas Cromwell was orchestrated with the same methodical precision that had characterized his own rise to power. The Duke of Norfolk, representing the conservative Catholic faction, recognized that Cromwell's fall required more than royal displeasure. It demanded a carefully constructed legal case that would justify the extreme punishment Norfolk's party sought to inflict. Norfolk's strategy centered on exploiting Henry's growing paranoia about religious orthodoxy and personal loyalty. By portraying Cromwell as a secret radical who had manipulated royal policy for his own ideological ends, Norfolk could transform the king's personal irritation into righteous fury. The conservative faction began gathering evidence of Cromwell's correspondence with Protestant reformers across Europe, particularly his communications with the more radical elements in German Lutheran circles. Letters that had once represented prudent diplomatic intelligence gathering were now reinterpreted as evidence of treasonous conspiracy. Cromwell's network of Protestant contacts, previously viewed as valuable assets, became proof of his dangerous religious sympathies. Stephen Gardiner, the conservative Bishop of Winchester, played a crucial role in developing the theological case against Cromwell. Gardiner had long resented Cromwell's influence over religious policy and saw the minister's current vulnerability as an opportunity to reassert clerical authority over the English Church. His scholarly reputation lent credibility to accusations that Cromwell had promoted heretical doctrines contrary to the king's own theological preferences. The morning of June 10, 1540 began like any other for Thomas Cromwell. As Lord Privy Seal and recently created Earl of Essex, he attended the regular council meeting at Westminster, discussing routine matters of state with his fellow councillors. Nothing in his demeanor suggested awareness of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, though some observers would later claim to have noticed unusual tension in the room. The trap was sprung with devastating suddenness. In the middle of the council proceedings, the Duke of Norfolk rose from his seat and began reading formal charges of treason and heresy against Cromwell. The accusations were comprehensive, alleging that the Earl had promoted heretical doctrines, maintained treasonous correspondence with foreign enemies, and deliberately deceived the king about matters of vital importance to the realm. Cromwell's initial reaction was one of shocked disbelief. The man who had orchestrated similar scenes against others now found himself the target of the same legal machinery he had helped to perfect. His attempts to defend himself were cut short as Norfolk commanded the guards to arrest him immediately. The speed of the proceedings left no opportunity for the elaborate legal maneuvering that had characterized Cromwell's own prosecutions of his enemies. The symbolism of the arrest was carefully calculated to humiliate the fallen minister. The Garter insignia recently bestowed upon him as England's highest honor was stripped from his person in full view of the assembled council. His staff of office was broken and cast aside, and his ceremonial sword was removed, traditional gestures that marked his complete fall from grace and his transformation from peer of the realm to common prisoner. Rather than subjecting Cromwell to a traditional trial, his enemies chose to destroy him through a Bill of Attainder, a legislative act that declared him guilty of treason without the need for formal legal proceedings. This method offered several advantages to his persecutors. It avoided the inconvenience of presenting evidence in open court, eliminated the possibility of an effective defense, and ensured that the outcome would be determined by political considerations rather than legal technicalities. The Bill of Attainder represented a particularly cynical use of parliamentary procedure transforming what should have been a deliberative legislative body into an instrument of personal destruction. The charges outlined in the bill were comprehensive but vague, alleging that Cromwell had committed and done treasons, murders, robberies, and other most heinous offenses, without providing specific details that could be challenged or refuted. The religious charges formed the core of the case against him. The bill accused him of promoting heretical doctrines, protecting known heretics, and undermining the king's authority in matters of faith. These accusations were particularly damaging because they touched on Henry's deep concern about religious orthodoxy and his desire to be seen as a defender of true Christian doctrine against both papal authority and Protestant extremism. The period between Cromwell's condemnation and execution was marked by a systematic campaign to extract every possible advantage from his desperate situation. His enemies understood that a man facing certain death might be willing to provide valuable information or perform final services in exchange for the faint hope of clemency or a more merciful death. The most significant demand placed upon the condemned minister was his assistance in annulling Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Despite his own desperate circumstances, Cromwell was required to use his legal expertise and diplomatic connections to facilitate the dissolution of the marriage he had originally negotiated. This requirement added a particularly cruel dimension to his final weeks, as he was forced to participate in undoing his own work while awaiting execution. On the morning of July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led from his cell in the Tower of London to face his final public appearance. The date had been carefully chosen to coincide with Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, ensuring that the king's joy would not be marred by dwelling on the unpleasant necessity of executing his former minister. This timing reflected the calculated cruelty that had characterized every aspect of Cromwell's downfall. The journey from cell to scaffold was deliberately designed as a final humiliation. Cromwell, who had once traveled in state as one of England's most powerful nobles, now walked in chains through the jeering crowds that had gathered to witness his death. The contrast between his former magnificence and present degradation provided a stark lesson in the transitory nature of worldly power that was not lost on observers. The historical record surrounding Thomas Cromwell's final days and execution is complicated by conflicting contemporary accounts that reflect the political divisions and personal biases of their authors. These contradictory narratives have created ongoing debates among historians about the true nature of Cromwell's crimes, the fairness of his trial, and the circumstances of his death. Catholic contemporary observers, writing from the perspective of those who opposed Cromwell's religious policies, tended to portray his downfall as divine justice for his role in dismantling England's traditional religious institutions. These accounts emphasized his humble origins and alleged theological errors, presenting his destruction as the inevitable consequence of his presumption in challenging established authority. Protestant writers conversely viewed Cromwell as a martyr to the cause of religious reform, who had been destroyed by conservative enemies seeking to reverse his progressive policies. These accounts emphasized his administrative competence and his role in freeing England from papal authority, while portraying his downfall as the result of court intrigue rather than genuine legal violations. They often questioned the legitimacy of the charges against him and suggested that his execution represented a miscarriage of justice. Foreign diplomatic sources provide a third perspective, focusing on the international implications of Cromwell's fall rather than domestic religious considerations. These accounts often emphasize the impact of his destruction on England's foreign relations, particularly the damage to the Protestant alliance he had worked to construct. Within months of Thomas Cromwell's execution, Henry VIII began to display signs of regret about his decision to destroy his former minister. The king's remorse was not driven by moral considerations, but by practical recognition that he had eliminated the most competent administrator in his government at a time when effective governance was desperately needed. The administrative chaos that followed Cromwell's death made his former efficiency painfully obvious to all who had to deal with the consequences. Henry's famous complaint that he had been served by false accusations in the matter of Cromwell's execution revealed succumbed to both his growing awareness of his mistake and his characteristic inability to accept personal responsibility for his decisions. The terrifying final days of Thomas Cromwell offer a window into the brutal realities of power in Tudor England, where proximity to absolute authority could transform loyal service into mortal danger with shocking suddenness. His story serves as one of history's most compelling examples of how quickly fortune can change in the corridors of power, and how the very skills that elevate a person to greatness can become the instruments of their destruction. What makes Cromwell's fate particularly chilling is not simply the speed of his fall, but the systematic nature of his destruction. The same governmental machinery he had helped to create and refine was turned against him with devastating efficiency. His enemies understood his methods so well because they had watched him employ them against others, and they applied his own techniques with merciless precision. The psychological dimensions of his downfall reveal the human cost of political ambition in an absolute monarchy. The man who had confidently manipulated the levers of power found himself helpless against the same forces he had once controlled. His final weeks, marked by desperate attempts to secure clemency through continued service, demonstrate the terrible vulnerability of those who stake everything on royal favor. The isolation and despair he experienced in his final days serve as a stark reminder of the personal price of political involvement. The conflicting historical accounts of Cromwell's character and crimes reflect the continuing power of his story to generate debate and disagreement. Whether viewed as a progressive reformer destroyed by conservative enemies, or as an overreaching administrator who finally exceeded his authority, his fate continues to fascinate historians and popular audiences alike. The ambiguity surrounding his true character only adds to the enduring appeal of his story. Perhaps most significantly, Cromwell's destruction illustrates the inherent instability of political systems based on personal rule rather than institutional constraints. The arbitrary nature of his condemnation and execution demonstrates how quickly legal procedures can be subordinated to political convenience when sufficient power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual. His case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute authority and the vulnerability of those who serve it. The legacy of his administrative innovations, particularly his development of modern governmental techniques, has outlasted the memory of his political failures. While his name became synonymous with treachery in the immediate aftermath of his execution, modern historians recognize his contributions to the development of efficient governmental administration. The irony that his most lasting achievements were accomplished by the same methods that ultimately destroyed him adds another layer of complexity to his historical significance. The enduring fascination with Thomas Cromwell's story reflects its embodiment of universal themes about ambition, power, and human nature. His rise from humble origins to the highest levels of government speaks to the possibilities inherent in talent and determination, while his swift destruction reminds us of the precarious nature of worldly success. In the end, his terrifying final days serve as both a historical curiosity and a timeless meditation on the costs of political participation and the dangerous allure of absolute power. Thomas Cromwell's life and death stand as a testament to the brutal realities of power in Tudor England. His rise from obscurity to the heights of influence, only to be cast down by the very forces he had mastered, serves as a cautionary tale for all who seek to navigate the treacherous waters of political ambition. In the end, his story is not just a historical footnote, but a timeless reflection on the human condition, reminding us that even the most powerful are but pawns in the grand game of power.